Washington Journal continues.
Our next guest served as this administration's first press secretary, Sean Spicer, joining us. He's also the author of The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President. Mr. Spicer, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Spicer, what's the perception of a White House press secretary and what's the reality?
Well, that's a great question, because I think this administration has definitely taken things to a different level in terms of the intensity and scrutiny that position receives. But traditionally, I think a press secretary's job is to convey the information to the media and to the public when the president is unable to do so for themselves. I think the perception sometimes is that the press secretary, from a lot of what I heard, was that people would say, well, what do you think? And I think that the reality is the press secretary is not supposed to be speaking for themselves, but for the principle that they represent.
You write in the book, when it comes to President Trump's interest in your job and how he engaged with you in your job, you said this: he was always full of questions, wanting background of where a story comes from, and of course curious to know what we were going to say about it. And he was never shy about giving us directions. He was extremely engaged, very particular, and insistent about how he wanted the points delivered. The more time I spent with him, the more I came to understand that President Trump wanted me to repeat his answers to the press verbatim. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, look, I've been doing this a long time, Pedro. Served a lot of different members of Congress, government officials, and candidates. And I think generally speaking, the press team comes up with the lines that they think are most effective. President Trump is much more specific with how he wants his voice communicated. I think if you think about it, again, as I described the position, the job is to communicate the views and principle and ideas that the president, in this case, want communicated. And the president recognizes that if that's going to be the case, then he wants to make sure that those words are conveyed exactly as he sees fit.
Walk a little bit then about the engagement on a day-to-day basis that you had with the president, especially in developing what the statements and the comments from the White House would be.
So that's a great question. I talk about this in the book, that in order to get ready for the briefing or a major event, we would spend a good chunk of the morning going back and forth, trying to develop what the questions and appropriate responses would be. We'd bring in the subject matter experts, so that might be somebody from the National Security Council, maybe someone from the Office of Management and Budget. Depending on what the issue was, you'd bring in the relevant subject matter experts, and they would give you their take as to where the issue was, where they thought it was headed, and the appropriate response. Then I would go in and increasingly so started to check in with the president and said, these are the questions that I believe we're most likely to get. This is what your team recommends. And he would kind of give his take, and we'd go back and forth, sometimes with what he wanted, and then might have to check back in with some of the as I mentioned, the subject matter experts to say, hey, the president really wants to convey it in this way. Do you think that's going to be an issue? Is that okay? And so depending on the issue and the nature of it and where it stood, it might be one single interaction, or it might be a back and forth.
When the president makes statements about specific members of the press, CNN or other news organizations, did that shade how you approached your job? Who got questions? How you approached engagement with these news organizations?
No, I don't think he never asked me to specifically call anyone or not call anyone. That was something that I did myself, and I write about it extensively in the book, that I intentionally, I think, wanted to broaden the number of reporters that were called on in the briefing room and really try to expand, and for what one reporter called democratize the press room. That I believed that reporters from a variety of backgrounds, whether it was like foreign media, niche publications, local media, conservative talk radio, foreign, different ethnic outlets, all deserved a question. And so I tried to kind of vary who I called on and the frequency of it, just so that there was a variety of voices being heard within the briefing room.
The book is called The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President. Sean Spicer, our guest, and if you want to ask him questions about it, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8002 for independents. Mr. Spicer, you and others, particularly you, though, have heard the president's comments about the press, enemy of the people, etc. What do you think about those statements? Is that appropriate for a president?
Well, I've said this very clearly, Pedro, that I think that a democracy, especially ours, is the sort of the beacon of democracies throughout the world, needs to have a free and robust press corps. I'm not a fan of calling out any industry with a broad brush. So if, with respect to the media, I think it's more effective to call out, inappropriate behavior or disrespectful behavior or a bad story. Or a lack of professionalism in a specific case, rather than paint an entire industry with a broad brush. Because when you do that, I don't think that you sort of throw out the good with the bad. And as I write in the book, there are a lot of good reporters that are in that briefing room. So I'm not one that believes or advocates that you should sort of use any industry and call it one particular thing. I know that as a conservative and as someone who voted for and supported President Trump, that I don't like it when people ascribe those kind of qualities to conservatives and they say, well, all conservatives believe this, or people who support Donald Trump are the following. So I've not been a big believer in using sort of sweeping comments to paint any industry or group as being synonymous with a particular trait.
So it was recently, you probably saw this as well on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. It was the White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, talking about reporting of the president, particularly with him and other members of the White House. I want you to hear his perspective on his job and get your take on it. Mr. Spicer, what do you think of that assessment?
Well, I think it's ironic that, it's funny, Jim never actually talked about his own behavior. When was the last time that Jim actually broke a story? The reality is it's all about him and his antics, and this is the problem. He's turned the page from being a reporter to being an activist and a detractor of the president. It's not about actually reporting with him. He coaxed himself in this idea of the First Amendment and a free press, which we all support. But look, his behavior has been unprofessional and disrespectful at best. He posted this photo a couple of weeks back of himself about 100 yards back from the president and made it seem as though the president ignored a question that he had asked when his own fellow reporters called him out and said there was no way the president could have possibly heard him because he was so far back behind tons and tons of, or hundreds of people in an audience. But to him, it's about the show. And I don't, I think the idea that he tries to make it about asking questions and facts is just ridiculous, because at the end of the day, with him specifically, it's not about free press. It's not about tough questions. It's not about stories. It's about him creating a scene in the briefing room, him jumping up and down, shouting stuff out, and making himself the story. And most reporters will tell you that it should never be about them. It's always about the story. And unfortunately, it's the inverse with him.
You say in your book, and I'm boiling this down a little bit, when it comes to White House coverage, there's 4 things that you're aware of: an unshakable focus on palace intrigue, a desire to break the story over real reporting, the desire to use cameras to become a cable star, and a partisan pack mentality.
Yep. Well, I think all of those are true. And frankly, I go into detail in each one of them. But the reality is there is a pack mentality. And I talk about specific examples where reporters who dare to break out of that and ask questions that they think are important, either because they themselves find a topic interesting or because they represent a particular constituency, get sort of mocked and ridiculed by their colleagues if they don't go along with whatever the collective wisdom and thought is for the day. So, I mean, that is a big problem. And I think that you've seen this more and more, where reporters have tried to make themselves the story and try to figure out how to get themselves on TV rather than focus on issues and the pursuit of a particular story. So I think there is a big problem with the behavior and the professionalism that's exhibited in that room.
Mr. Spicer joins us until close to 10 o'clock. If you want to ask him questions, again, the phone lines will be on the screen. Our first call for you, sir, comes from Minnesota. This is Derek on our independent line. You're on with Sean Spicer. Go ahead.
Good morning, America. Good morning, C-SPAN. Hey, Sean, appreciate your time this morning. I just have a couple questions. I'd like a real definite definition of free press, because from what I understand, the emperor has no clothes. The media has no clothes because they've been exposed the last 2 years for how much biased they are towards this president. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And I think every study says that 90+% are Democrats or leftists or whatever. What is the actual free press? Because there's so much opinion, commentary, blah, blah, blah. I have a daughter who's going to one of the best journalism schools in the country, and I'd like your advice to her going into it. because I don't understand what the free press is anymore when it's all just based on conjecture, opinion, and
Gotcha, Derek. We'll let our guest respond. Mr. Spicer, go ahead.
Well, Derek, I mean, I think Derek brings up some good points. And as I said in my earlier response, I don't like to make one big sweeping comment about all of them. There are a lot of good journalists that are in that briefing room. But I think by and large, the sort of Washington elite media that's represented by the networks and the cables and sort of the big conglomerate newspapers and wire services, tend not to understand or take the time to go outside the beltway and understand what's going on out there. Look, I think a free press in my mind means that they can write whatever they want and that we have a variety. We have liberal news, we have conservative news, we have business news. The ability to write and express yourself in this country is something that we cherish. But I think that, to your point, Derek, we need to recognize that so many of these folks in the establishment media have gone from being objective or trying to appear objective to going to being activists. And I think in expressing an opinion, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on cable news outlets, that they've stopped reporting and gone on to, literally opining about their belief, their ideas. And then, as you point out in your question, I think too often there's this degree of stories that are built completely on conjecture, where it's about what we think he is thinking or where we think, as opposed to actually reporting stuff. It's all about conjecture and subjective ideas about what they think might happen versus what the facts tell us.
From Minnesota, Republican line, Brad, hello.
Well, good morning there. I haven't spoken to you people for a while, but this is kind of a great topic to talk about. But I look at life as, that past behavior will tell you the near future. And years ago, it started in 1950. It was called Operation Mockingbird. And it was the CIA manipulating the people through the media. Well, it's kind of continuing even, another step, but it's the media with the FBI this time. But we've got a big problem with our media today, that they want to manipulate the people.
Mr. Spicer, what do you think?
Well, look, I don't know that. Look, I write in the book, and Pedro, you just mentioned it a moment ago, that I try to give people an idea of what was going on behind the scenes in terms of some of the stories and some of what actually happens, beyond a story that you either read or see, what's happening in the lead up to that story and the back and forths and interaction that occurs. But I think that there is no question that a lot of folks in the media, as I mentioned to the last caller, have an agenda, have an opinion, but I don't think that that's all of them. I do think that there are a lot of good reporters that do a good job. I just think that more and more we're seeing a lot of these, what you would call establishment media types, really get involved in expressing themselves and taking an opinion.
When you say reporters who do a good job, name one, and why is that person doing a good job?
Jen Jacobs, Bloomberg. I think because you can disagree with us. There are plenty of stories, and again, in the book, Pedro, I mentioned a lot more than that. Margaret Talev, also of Bloomberg, who was the last White House Correspondents' Press Association's president, I think is a fair and balanced reporter. Steve Holland from Reuters. The reason is this: they can write tough stories, they can be tenacious, but they're professional and fair, meaning that they tell you, hey, this is what we have gathered, what's your side, you have a reasonable amount of time to respond to it. Too often, a lot of these reporters call and say, hey, we're on deadline, we're about to publish, what's your response to this major charge? It's always not something that can be responded to in 5 or 10 minutes. But too often, that's the mentality today. Hey, we have 8 anonymous sources that are saying the following, you have 5 minutes to respond. That's not professional, that's not fair, that's an attempt to engage in gotcha journalism. And I think that's where too often the stories are based now, is this attempt to get a clip or a click or be sensational and kind of follow the spirit of tabloid press versus straight journalism. So there are a lot of reporters that call and say, I'm working on this story, I'd like to hear your side of it, can you provide people that give us some background on it? But they truly come at the story from an objective place and try to gather the facts and try to understand what's happening, versus I think a lot of these people that figure out the narrative that they want to pursue, build a case, and then call you and tell you they're about to publish it.
You've seen you as
or
well.
in many cases don't even tell you that.
So, what you're thinking when it comes to news sources? Do you equate mainstream media, and I'll just use the term there, with blogs such as Breitbart or the Daily Caller or CRTV? Do you equate those when it comes to news outlets in your thinking?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, but I think there's a spectrum. Sure, I read all of those, but I also will sometimes look at, left-leaning places like the Daily Beast or Huffington Post. So I think that you need to look at all of it and collectively try to gather as much as you can. But there's as much as there is on the right, there's definitely a lot on the left.
Oh, who do you like on the, as you describe it, the left? Which is a main source for you?
Well, it's not a question of like. I think part of the job, if you're really trying to understand an issue, is to look at the full spectrum. So I might read a story from the Huffington Post or the Daily Beast, but when I do, I think there's a level of scrutiny that I'll put through and say, okay, now I actually want to find out further. Because I don't, generally speaking, when you read a story from one of those sources, it makes you wonder how much of it is an activism type journalism versus an attempt to really write it straight up, or something from BuzzFeed where it's all the left-leaning sites, and you have to go, okay, now I need to kind of further investigate to find out whether this was them pursuing an agenda or how much of it is accurate.
From Minnesota, Democrats line, Tammy. Good morning. You're next.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Thanks for taking my call. Question, Mr. Spicer. Just wondering, which president, Obama or Trump, had the biggest inauguration?
That's a great question. You should read the book. It's on. I think I've talked about that very extensively, about that first day and what my goal was to try to communicate, which was frankly, to talk about the level of enthusiasm and interest there was in the inauguration.
Republican line, Georgia. This is Joy. Hi.
Hi there. I just want to discuss something about the different TV news people. I try to watch different news programs, especially MSNBC, and I try to watch CNN, and I try my best to watch them, but I hear it's nothing but hate, just pure hate. And I want to try to learn something from them, but the hatred that they spew about our president is just unbelievable. I've never learned as much about our country with the president as I have with President Trump. I have learned more in my lifetime, and I'm 74 years old. But I have to honestly turn it to someone. I know when you say Fox News, you say that's a Trump thing, but they don't spew the hatred like these other TV programs do. It's unbelievable. And I used to like MSNBC. I used to like Joe in the morning, but I can't even stand to watch it anymore.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you very much. Mr. Spicer.
Well, look, I think, we've talked about this during this segment, but I think each of these channels has now staked out, where they stand on the political spectrum. And you're seeing it now. That you've got MSNBC and CNN that have staked out the left, Fox is staking out the right. One of the reasons that I love C-SPAN is that you guys allow people to talk, you allow the viewers to make up their mind. So people can watch a government official take questions, give their response, or watch a hearing. And it allows people to see their government exactly what is said in an unfiltered way. I do think, as I've mentioned before, you've now seen a lot of activism journalism, and especially on the cable news channels, where there's a degree to which they understand that their audience and therefore their business model is predicated upon tailoring and focusing on a particular niche of the political spectrum.
Devin in Port Charlotte, Florida, Democrats line.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Just a simple question. Any regrets, and what would you change if, since in hindsight? And the other thing is, It's been documented that this current administration lies consistently every day. So I'd just like your response to that. Thank you.
So, Devin, on the first thing, I think the book, the reason I wrote the briefing is to give people an understanding of who I am, what I did, what was going on behind the scenes. And there are plenty of things that I've said that I would love to do over. Sometimes it's the tone that I use, sometimes it's the interaction that I had, sometimes it's the way I communicated. So there's no question And I write about this specifically on several instances on how, I would have liked to have been able to do it over. That's not how we get to live life, though. And part of what I explain in the book is that what I've tried to do is recognize whether it's a personal interaction or a professional, issue or event, that the question that really comes down to it is, do you learn from those? Are you a better person or a better professional because of how you've looked back on an event and recognized how you could have done it better? So there are plenty of circumstances where I look back and say, wow, I could have answered that better. I could have interacted with that person better. I talk about those extensively in the book, I think in a very candid way, because I want people to understand that I'm not perfect. It was a tough job. It was intense. There are things that I wish I could do over again. And I want people to understand, not just, not hear an excuse, but sometimes the context in which I made those decisions and why I did and what I would have, to your question, done differently.
The book is called The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President. And Sean Spicer joining us, serving as the White House press secretary in the Trump administration. Mr. Spicer, if I may, a couple of questions about your former colleague, Omarosa Manigault, particularly what she said specifically to you. This about a non-disclosure agreement and basically essentially saying these are nice, this gives you some type of money to say nice things about the president. First of all, what's your response to
that? It is completely false. Here's the deal. Let's just walk through the timeline. I left the White House September 1st of last year. I signed a book deal in December of that year. I submitted the book in May of that year. I joined America First, a super PAC that supports the president's policies, on June 15th. So I hadn't received a penny from anyone in the Trump apparatus or anyone connected to Trump until June 15th of this year, after my book had been submitted. I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement. America First has put out a statement saying exactly that I didn't join them until the 15th and that I didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement. So look, you have to consider the source. She is out there trying to make money. She's trying to hawk a book. And the contradictions of, the interesting thing is I just talked about my own timeline. Let's look at her timeline. She left the White House at the beginning of the year, where when she left office, she continuously praised the president, and then within weeks was shopping a book to publishers, claiming quite the opposite, because it was pretty clear that they were telling her that in order to sell, in order to get an advance, she would have to say something nasty. Look, my book, which has been out there, I think is very candid, talking about my experience, what I would do to the last caller, Devin, talking about what I would do better, how I could have, had some of those instances. I don't think if you read that book that you can say that I wasn't extremely candid in some of my shortcomings. Her book is completely different. It's an attempt to go after the President of the United States because she got fired. She even lies about that. When she left, she said she resigned. Now she's saying she was fired. She brought a personal recording device into the Situation Room of the White House to record the Chief of Staff of the White House in violation of countless security protocols, in violation of her own security clearance. I mean, look, you just have to look at the source, and I think that there's no question that she has a huge credibility issue.
This is Mary, Las Vegas, Nevada, independent line.
Hey, Sean, you're out there trying to hawk a book, too. As far as Omarosa goes, I'll wait to hear the tapes. I mean, the president does lie a lot, and so it's coming back at him, and I don't know. There's so many horrible things going on. I mean, he stands up there and he calls the press enemy of the people, right out of the authoritarian playbook. I mean, he goes after the NFL for taking a knee and sends a delegation of 7 to Russia on the 4th of July. Then he stands up there at Helsinki. I mean, Putin was just smiling. He looked like he just got through eating red meat. So, I mean, if he deserves to be defended, he will be. But the truth does need to come out, and I think CNN and MSNBC are doing a dang good job. And Fox News has just gone off the charts somewhere.
Gotcha, Mary. We'll let our guest respond.
Well, look, there's no question about it. I'm on here. I'm talking about the book. I did write a book. I am trying to promote it. But there's a difference. And I think if you read my book, you'll recognize that I talk about my life, my experiences. I think it's a very candid understanding of who I am as a person. but I don't go out there and act in a disloyal way as one of my former colleagues did. And I think the difference is, Omarosa is selling a book trying to, that goes after the President of the United States, who she praised publicly on the record, both in print and on video, within days of leaving the White House. I don't think there's anything inconsistent about my account and what I've said in that book, but I think there's a totally different style between how I'm approaching this and how she's approached it. So, I think that the tone and the tenor are vastly different. The approach is different. I'm very proud of what I've written. I think you've seen, by and large, the people who have read the book will tell you that it's a very candid approach to who I am as a person and the experiences of the last couple of years, and especially with respect to the campaign. If you're interested in understanding what was going on during that campaign, the data and the field operation that was used, part of the reason I wanted to write it was so that people could actually understand what was going on during the campaign. It's not just about the White House.
Did you have to get approval from the White House for your manuscript?
No.
And how is it that you didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement?
With America First?
No, with the White House.
Well, what Omarosa's charge was that when I left the White House, I, quote, took hush money and signed a non-disclosure agreement when I left. I did not. That's the charge that she made.
Okay. Republican line from Ohio. Jed, hello.
Good morning. You there?
You're on with our guest.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, my name's Ed. I was many years a service company commander, and Sean's right on the money. I'm going to buy his book. The media is so biased, 98% negative, except Fox, which all of them go against. That one channel, their ratings are better than all of them. MSNBC, all the people, I still watch them channels, love to see the opposite side. MSN, they're all by the same company, NBC, CNN, you name it. They are hateful. And this Omarosa, the media hated her, all those channels. Mocked her when she was first brought in this position over a year ago. As soon as she left, what happened now, negative and all this, and I hope they prosecute her for those tapings. Now they love her and give her nonstop. This is the typical 98% fake media. Keep it going, Sean. I'm buying your book today as soon as I can.
Mr. Spicer, if you would, a little of the inside. When it comes to recording devices, what's the rule then within the White House?
Well, there's two issues, Pedro, which is what's the rule within the White House. My understanding since I've left is that General Kelly, for security purposes, has banned the use of personal cell phones in the West Wing because they present a danger to, entities that are seeking to gain information. So they've banned those. But there's a big difference. The Situation Room is what they call a SCIF, a classified area that no recording devices, no Bluetooth-enabled technology is allowed in, and that you are required to check in all recording devices, all wireless capabilities. Bringing in any kind of recording device into the Situation Room or any other classified setting is clearly a security violation. So while taping somebody may be untrustworthy or disloyal, there's a difference between doing that and bringing a recording device and then willfully using it in a classified setting, which is what she did by using it in the Situation Room.
From Massachusetts, Democrats line, James, go ahead. You're on with our guest.
Good morning, Mr. Spicer. I'd like to ask a couple of questions, if I might. I know that everybody is always claiming that Donald Trump lies a lot. I'm a Democrat. I make no bones about it. But I do have a problem. I like to think a little bit. What the media does is, like, if they say Donald Trump says something happened 48 times, and the media looked it up and it only happened 46, they call him a liar. They everything he talks about, they just exaggerate it, twist it, and everything. And I'm getting a little upset with my own party. They also have fact check this, fact check that. PolitiFact, owned by Politico. Fact check this, owned by the other organization that Obama was on the board with. And the censorship is unbelievable. They track that Donald Trump says 3,000 lies, but they don't track that they only covered a legitimate story for 28 seconds over 3 networks. And I just can't understand. I'm a Democrat my whole life. I've never been so frustrated in my whole life to try to find out what the hell the real truth is around here.
James, thank you very much.
Well, I think you've got a good point. I mean, look, I think one of the things I talk about in the book is that a lot of these fact checkers are opinion checkers, right? So there's an example I put in the book where Vice President Pence at one point made a comment that more people in America are working than ever before, which is absolutely correct when he made the statement, and yet you had the fact checkers come after him and say, well, it's lacking the context of that of whether or not that is in relationship to the total population as a percentage, or whether he's referring to the exact number. I mean, that's an opinion. The reality is that he was right when he stated the fact, and I put it in there because so often these folks are looking to focus on an opinion or a way that they want it communicated. The reality is, to your point, that these folks cover what they want. They don't cover certain other things. You talk about the remains of our servicemen and women, or servicemen coming back from Korea the other day, and most of these networks paid scant coverage to it. It was disgraceful. There's a lot of stuff that they refuse to cover. They've clearly, by every study, whether it's the Media Research Center, Pew, or even Harvard's own Shorenstein Center, talked about how the coverage of this president has been unbelievably negative. 90% in some studies suggest that that's the coverage. When you look at that, contrast that with the results the president is getting on the economy and in so many other areas, fulfilling the promises that he made to the American people, you kind of realize how out of whack that is. So whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican, and I thank you for your comments, obviously as a Democrat from Massachusetts, you understand that sometimes there's a desire for the other side to want the other side not to do well, but in this case, it just is out of whack by any objective standard.
Mr. Spicer, you mentioned the economy in your book. You highlight that you used to work for the U.S. Trade Representative. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you, in light of your experiences there, what do you think about the current approaches that this administration is taking to trade policy, particularly to China, and do you worry about this idea of a trade war?
Well, sure, I worry about the idea of a trade war. I think there's a difference. Look, one of the things that people have to understand is that through a variety of trade deals that go back a long time, we've given market access to our country, to our consumers, to our citizens, usually at a very, very low tariff or non-tariff barrier rate, whereas many of our products face high tariffs and steep barriers to entry into many of our trading partners' markets. The president clearly is fulfilling a campaign pledge that he made, and frankly, a belief that he's had going back until, in many cases, the 80s, that we need better trade deals. So he's fulfilling the promises and the pledges that he's made to stand up for American workers and say, if you're going to get access to our country's market, we need at least some kind of similar access to your market. I think it's good that he's standing up and being tough. I do worry about how quick we can resolve these things. But I think for so long, many countries haven't taken us seriously. And now under this president, they are. He's getting results, especially you've seen in Europe, a pledge when the European Community president came over and talked about an agreement to lower their tariff rates. That's a good thing for our consumers, whether you're a service provider, an agriculture grower, or a manufacturer. Those are all good things for our customers, our consumers, our workers. But I do think that we've got to be careful how long we go at this. There are big countries at stake which can affect the prices that our consumers pay. So the more that the economic team can really work as diligently as possible to resolve these issues, the better.
Would you say then, or would you just go as far as saying it's an economic risk using these tariffs the way he's using them?
Well, but there's also there's a risk for not using them, right? So the question is, when do if we don't do anything, our workers will face the stiff tariffs and barriers to entry into those markets. So if we do nothing, there's a risk there as well. The question is, what is the appropriate amount of risk and for how long? That's the issue. But you've seen in many cases the president's tactics being enormously successful in taking down tariff rates and other barriers to entry in the market when it comes to our trading partners. So the question is, what's the risk if you do nothing versus what's the risk if you do something? And how long do you want to withstand that level of risk or uncertainty? So as I said, I think it's a long time coming that this action takes place. The question is, how long is it sustainable? And I know that the team has been working to try to resolve this. My point is that I think the sooner that we can resolve this, the better for our country.
This is from Richfield, Wisconsin. Republican line, Greg on with Sean Spicer. Hello.
Good morning, guys. I'm glad to have you on this morning, Sean. I would like to make a couple things clear to Republicans, and I think that many would agree with me. I did not vote for Donald Trump because he was a celebrity. I did not vote for him because he had orange hair. I voted for him because he was the GOP, the Republican candidate. Now we've got never-Trumpers who are still out there. Can you say George Will? And people who seem to forget we need to support the Republican Party and the conservative viewpoint. And as far as Omarosa, she better make enough money on this book because nobody's ever going to offer her a job again. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your comments. I think that, I agree with you. At some point, the voters of our party, by large margin, went out and voted for this president as our nominee, and he won the general election. That's important. I think Republicans have to understand that we're getting things done. I think one of the untold pieces of this president's legacy is going to be what he's done on the judiciary, whether it's now the second Supreme Court justice that he's put forward, and hopefully another one. But it's also the appellate court and the circuit court and the number of federal judges that he has put forth to be interpreter or be maintainers of our Constitution is phenomenal, and it's going to be part of his enduring legacy.
You talk about in your book the calls you had to make the members of the press with stories that you took issue with. Were those calls including, as the previous caller said, to never-Trumpers, those conservatives, those Republicans who didn't support President Trump?
I'm sorry, Pedro, say that again.
So for those conservatives or Republicans who didn't support President Trump, never-Trumpers, did you ever have to make calls as press secretaries complaining about the perspectives or the opinions they put out there?
I mean, I know some of them, so from time to time I would have the opportunity to speak with them, and I think I would echo the sentiments of the previous caller, which is that, look, this president, you may not like some of his style, but he's getting things done that many conservatives have fought decades for. And tried to make the case why I think that they, should support the president's agendas and policies.
From Texas Independent Line, Robert, hello.
Good morning, and thank you, Sean, for coming on. This is a wonderful outlet, and a lot of viewers really like to be able to call in and have questions, and I'm being one of them. I'm wondering if there isn't some way, or what your opinion would be on having some kind of ethical standard for reporters that could basically bar somebody from spreading mistruths. Now, I get the idea there's spin and there's different outlooks, taking the same topic. I mean, that's the whole idea of debating an issue. But when something is actually false, totally misleading, numbers are not hitting what the actual figures are or whatever, it's a falsehood. Should there be some kind of ethical standard that could find a reporter being barred from further news reporting if they're putting out false news stories? And number two, Sean, the division that we have in this country, the bias, what do you feel needs to be done to address this division within the press? Thank you.
Thanks for the call. Look, I think that the beauty of our country is that we have the First Amendment. People can write and print and articulate what they want. I do think that there's a lot of stories that the biggest problem with, and I write about this in the book extensively, is that the press loves to call out everybody else for their mistakes and the issues that they have with the arguments that they're making. But when they do it themselves, rarely, if ever, apologize for what they do or say. They call it an update, change the story, and act as if nothing happened. I don't believe in barring reporters. I don't believe in because I think that you can chastise them. And in the same First Amendment that gives members of the media to write what they want, gives each one of us the opportunity to criticize it. So if we don't like a story, then I think we can call it out. But I do think that there's a double standard in the way that they critique and call out everybody else for concerns that they have. But when they make mistakes themselves, they cover it up, they cover for each other. They rarely ever admit that they made a mistake. They never apologize for it. And I think that that's a problem. And frankly, one of the issues that is as a result of it is that you're seeing the credibility of a lot of journalists go way down. I don't think that's a good thing, though. Just so we're clear, I believe that we need a fair and free press. I believe that the more that we have faith in these institutions, it's good for democracy. The problem is that I think that a lot of these institutions have allowed bad reporting to go on, and it undermines the credibility of their own institutions.
About 10 more minutes with our guest. Tennessee is next. Terry, you're on. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call, and I really appreciate C-SPAN offering this platform. Mr. Spicer, you're really quick to blame the press, as is everyone in the Trump administration. Who might we begin to blame for treason against this country? Thank you.
Well, you should blame anyone who commits treason against this country. I'm not. And just to be clear, Terry, I'm not. I think part of the point, and Pedro mentioned it earlier. I think there's a lot of good reporters. I think we should hold those reporters up and talk to them and compliment them for the job that they do, and say that they are fair and tough, but they do it right. And we should use the good ones as an example. Because I think those are the ones that young reporters should look to and say, this is someone who does it right. They break stories. They're tough, tenacious, but they get it right. They're fair and professional. So we should exalt the good ones. So I think part of the reason I wrote the book, though, is so that people have an understanding of what it's like to deal with a lot of these stories that come out, and what the recourse is when you're not treated well, you're not treated fairly, or that they perpetrate a false narrative.
Illinois, from Harvey, Illinois. Joanne, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Spicer, I'm just calling because I saw where you're saying about disparaging the media as in whole, but when you were press secretary, you worked for the president, and you had to put out there what he wanted you to put out there, true or not true. And case in point, where the picture where they showed the inauguration of comparing it with President Obama's inauguration, and clearly that there were more people at President Obama's inauguration, but you had to come up there because you worked for the president to say what he wanted you to say, because if you had told the truth that day, you know that there were more, and the pictures don't lie. And the media, be from MSNBC or wherever they are, print news, the media has the right to say what the truth is, and they are telling the truth. Fox News, I see them. I watch Fox News, and I'm not a Republican, but I watch them to see what they're saying, and they've got it where they have everybody, even President Trump has it where everybody must hate the media. Why? You were a part of it.
Okay, major point, Joanne.
Well, Joanne, I don't hate the media, not at all. In fact, as I've stated a few times now, I believe that we need a free and fair press. I respect a lot of reporters, but I do think that in many cases there is false narratives, that there are people who are bad actors, and it's interesting. So I don't hate them by any means. In fact, I have a lot of respect for many of them. And for the institution, the role they play in our society. So I just want to make it clear that there's a big difference between calling out issues that you have and concerns and being or being complicit. And my job, I think to the extent possible, was to say, hey, here where we have a problem. Here's someone whose behavior I don't think is respectful. And go there.
Mr. Spicer,
I just want to be clear. And you mentioned at the beginning, I talk about that first day and the inauguration and what was going on and why I said what I said and what I would have done differently in the book and at great length. And I've said it before during this program. If there's a day that I would want to have as a do-over, that would be at the top of the list.
Mr. Spicer, when's the last time you spoke with President Trump?
Within the last couple of days.
Generally, what do you talk about these days when you speak?
Stories of the day, media appearances, things like that. And sometimes just to catch up.
Does he still consult you on approaches to how to, at least a media perspective from his point of view, or his press office, or things that they should be doing?
I will say what I've said all along, which is my conversations with the president and my counsel and advice to him and his comments to me are something that I don't comment on.
Regina is next, and Regina is from Pennsylvania, Republican line. Go ahead.
Good morning. I give you credit for taking the battleground here. I would like to try to get something into the people and to Trump. I don't really have a direct line, so right now you're the only person. And I thank God for C-SPAN because I watched the hearing on the Commerce Department with Wilbur Ross and watched how my own local newspaper, which I do not want to lose, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, which is already internet, but I get a local, more local. They print it. I thank God for it. And Wilbur Ross, I'm a little concerned with his concern over subsidized Canadian paper that they are being dumped on our country, 30% tariff. But is he really paying attention? Are his people trained enough to wait for these waivers? Or is he going to make an excuse that everybody's on the internet? I'm not really that good on the internet. I don't have the affordability for it. I see everybody else is being paid Obama phones and everything. But the bottom line is there's a print act, which I wish everybody would call their senators. It's by Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania. S2835, which would suspend tariffs on imported UGW paper until the
Gotcha. Regina, we'll just leave it there. Mr. Spicer, anything you want to take from that?
I don't. I'm not familiar with the piece of legislation, so I'm not in a position to comment on it.
Pennsylvania Republican line. Brian, hello.
Hello, Pedro, and thank you for C-SPAN. I just wanted to comment because everybody talks about fact-checking, and I had a case where in our recent gubernatorial race in Pennsylvania, and I think it was, I don't want to condemn AP, but I think it was AP, said that Governor Wolf, who's the current incumbent who won, he had a tax plan that's against the Constitution of Pennsylvania. And they listed his plan as, viable and, not a, I forget what their term for, that it was a valid tax plan. And I called up AP. I actually got the guy that wrote the story, which was troublesome, but I did it. And he said, well, I'm from Pennsylvania. And he was from Pennsylvania also. And I said, you must know the Constitution. You must know that that's illegal. And he said, oh, no, that's what the Republicans want to do. I said, it's against our Constitution.
Okay, caller, thank you. Mr. Spicer, go ahead.
Yeah, unfortunately, obviously, I'm not familiar with the particular story that he's referring to, or the obviously the interaction that he had. So it's a little difficult to comment. But like I said, I think that too often you see stories where somebody who's reporting tries to insert their personal beliefs as opposed to state on the record what's been going on, and that leads to some of the issues that where we are today.
Medford, Oregon, Democrats line. Jim, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you for putting me on. Sean, you have not addressed the fact that the president does tell lies, and you convey them to the papers and also the news people, and yet you have never admitted that those are a fact and not some kind of thing that was built up, done by the media. The media is not at fault when they put facts in and the truth. You and the president are at fault for making lies and expecting people to accept them. I don't understand your thinking.
Jim, that's the last call. Mr. Spicer, go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure what specifically Jim's referring to, but look, I think, and I mentioned this earlier, the things that I could have done better, absolutely. I write about them extensively in the book, but I think that the intensity and scrutiny of this administration is like nothing we've ever seen before. It's interesting how many things have happened in previous administrations, and yet no one seemed to have used anywhere near the same level of intensity and scrutiny. We all make mistakes, there's no question about it, but I think that the degree to which this administration has been scrutinized is in a category of its own.
Mr. Spicer, because messaging is your stock and trade, how do you think the White House currently works, or how effective do you think they are in messaging the various positions that the White House takes?
Well, I mean, I think that's frankly, a tough question to answer. I think on some things they do really well. I mean, you look at the Kavanaugh nomination in particular that's hot right now. They've done a fantastic job of conveying the depth and breadth of support and the qualifications and experience that Judge Kavanaugh has. So there are some areas where when you're dealing with, or some, the White House, there's a variety of issues that you're dealing with at any given time. Some are probably going to be where you're on offense, some are going to be on defense, some you're doing better or worse. But I think, so there's obviously a wide range and variety of issues that they're dealing with and how they are dealing with them.
The book is called The Briefing: Politics, the Press, and the President. Sean Spicer joining us. Mr. Spicer, you talked about the PAC that you work with. Could you describe again what that is? Mr. Spicer's gone. For the next 5 minutes, we're going to continue on with our program, and may weave in some of the calls, but Mr. Spicer has now left us. But about 5 minutes left. 202-748-8001 for Republicans. Democrats 202-748-8000. Independents 202-748-8002. This is from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. This highlights the city of Charlottesville yesterday, as it is remembering that 1 year anniversary of that rally that took place there, a rally that ended up with several deaths. This highlights one. This is standing where her daughter was fatally struck by a car 1 year ago. Susan Bro said people should not forget why her daughter and the other victims who were injured in Charlottesville that day were protesting in the street. She was here to support equality, affordable housing, and taking care of people the way that you would want to be taken care of. Please keep that in mind. Bro said of her daughter, Heather Heyer. That's the one death, actually, that came out of that yesterday, last year, the 1 year ago marking of the deadly Unite the Right rally. The event turned violent last year when white nationalists and neo-Nazis came to protest the planned removal of the city's Robert E. Lee statue, clashed with counter-protesters. Again, similar or other rallies of similar nature took place in Washington, D.C. yesterday. We aired both those rallies yesterday, and if you want to see them, you could go to our website at cspan.org. Other stories to show you: Pam Constable, writing out of Kabul, talking about the effects and the influence of the Taliban, saying that still holding on to parts of a key city there, saying insurgents held on to parts of the key city of Ghazni for a third day Sunday, putting up scattered resistance as Afghan forces backed by U.S. airstrikes worked to clear them out. The eastern city was overrun by hundreds of insurgent forces early Friday in the Taliban's latest attempt to capture an important urban target. The sustained onslaught by hundreds of Taliban figures is similar to several precious attacks on major cities, especially a 2015 assault on Kunduz, the north, and an attack in May on the Farah city in the west. Both were retaken by government forces after heavy fighting, but the near takeovers by the Taliban gave the insurgent group a psychological boost. That's Pam Constable writing in the Washington Post this morning.